Thank you, Glenn. My name's Brian. I'm an alcoholic. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an absolute pleasure to be invited. Just going to say in advance, I find myself unexpectedly caring for my 4-year-old on my own this evening. It wasn't part of the plan, so I do need to interrupt this meeting very briefly. I will keep it very brief. She's currently in the corner munching on some apple, behaving herself, watching her iPad, but that could change at any moment, so bear with me. But yes, indeed, it is a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be invited. So thank you, Glenn. It's always nice to be given the opportunity to talk about the power of God that passes through me to the benefit of other people. What a weird thing to say. What a incredibly bizarre thing to say. And I can assure you it's an incredibly bizarre thing to experience. Most of you already know that, of course. Welcome to the new people. Welcome to those who are counting days. Good to see my friend Yvonne, who is battling the same battle that I battled, and I guess many others here did as well. That is, if your story is similar to mine, in that you have this mental obsession that brings you to the point where you deliberately purchase with your own money an allergen and pour it on top of the allergy, knowing that it's going to screw up your life and doing it anyway. What's that about? You know, in the book, it's after the story of Jim. We all know the story of Jim, right? It's a car dealer, doing very, very well, and incredibly well, it says here he has a commendable World War record. He's a good salesman. Everybody likes him. He's an intelligent man, normal so far as we can see, except for a nervous disposition. I like him. He sounds amazing. So he inherited this automobile business. Could you imagine that? Anyway, he discovers that maybe drinking alcohol is a good idea. Turns out not to be. And he loses it all, loses the business, and then finds himself going back to work for the company that he used to own. Now, I'm not sure what way you're programmed, but I'm going to struggle with something like that. I'm going to struggle with the young fella telling me what to do in a business that I used to be the general of, if you like. And as did this guy, Jim, who goes into work feeling irritated. He has a few words with the boss. He decides to get the hell out of here and goes for a drive in the country. The story goes on, and I sometimes hear people understanding this text in such a way that Jim's actions were premeditated and he deliberately went somewhere where there was drink so that he could drink. I don't see it that way at all. Because on the previous page, it says, to his consternation, he finds himself drunk half a dozen times in rapid succession. His consternation, his dismay at something unexpected. He went to a roadside place that serves alcohol, and he went there many times before while he was sober. It wasn't that big a deal, but at some point this thought comes into his head that because he's had a bacon sandwich, that it would be okay to put some whiskey in the system if he mixes it with milk. Aside from the fact that that sounds like a rather vile cocktail, the hell's wrong with this guy? Like, what kind of crazy thinking is that? Book on page 37 says, whatever the precise definition of the word may be, we call this plain insanity. And how does it define insanity? The lack of proportion of the ability to think straight. So that's AA's definition of insanity. My definition of insanity, incidentally, is joining the 12-step fellowship and not working the 12 steps, but that's a whole different story. This definition of insanity is a lack of the proportion of the ability to think straight. He did not have the proportion of the ability to think straight. It was lacking. It was absent. It wasn't there. You see, Glenn, the odd thing is, whenever I first come into the rooms of AA, I've had some pretty mixed experiences. I'd love to tell you that I walked into the rooms of AA and I've seen the power of God shining from the front and I basked in its glory and I've been sober ever since. That's not my truth. I had a pretty rubbish start to the whole thing because some really well-meaning people said to me things like, the best advice we could give you is just don't take that first drink. The best advice we could give you is just don't take that first drink. And sometimes they said, one day at a time. Now, At the time, I was 42 years of age. I've been battling my inability to not take that first drink for 30 years at that point. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that it wasn't within my gift to make that decision. Just like Jim, I had the lack of proportion of the ability to think straight in respect to this transaction, if you like. So I quiver whenever I hear that kind of wording, whenever there's new people in the room, and I run quite quickly to maybe present the counter argument that that's not what AA is about. What AA is about is providing a mechanism whereby there is sanity and the sane and correct choices are made in around alcohol. An example I often give is I was down in our local restaurant close to where I live quite recently, and a young lady walked past with a tray of drinks upon which there was a fine claret, the waft of which hit my nose, and I thought, wow, that smells delicious. Do you know why I thought that, Glenn? Because it smelled delicious. Simple as that. And it wasn't followed up with, so therefore I shall buy some and I'll drink them because I've had a ham and cheese sandwich beforehand, as was the experience of our friend Jim here. Goes on to talk about these, what ways would put it, these parallel to the sound reasoning, there inevitably ran some insanely trivial excuse. I kind of like that. I like the image that conjures up in my head, these parallels. So I sort of think of two trains running side by side. It's a dead heat. Nobody's winning. The sound reasoning is, well, Jim, do you remember the last time you lost your business that you inherited? Your wife kicked you out. You ended up in a loony bin. Your kids don't really talk to you anymore. You don't want to be doing that again. That's a terrible idea. The insanely trivial excuse running at the same pace is saying, but you've had a sandwich and you're putting it into milk, so therefore it will be fine this time. Now, for those two to be given the same level of credibility, for them to be running parallel and side by side in and of itself is insane. But only one of those two is going to win the race. The insanely trivial won the race. You've had your sandwich, you're putting it in milk, it will be fine. And that is what happened. He lost it all again. He found himself drunk half a dozen times in rapid succession. Book says, the fact is that most alcoholics, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. I don't have choice. We are without defense against the first drink, it says. Don't ever tell an alcoholic, don't take the first drink, and that's the best advice we could give. That's an insane thing to say. To say to an alcoholic, you know what, good to see you, you're going to need a big book. We can get you sorted out with a sponsor immediately, today, before you leave this meeting. And we can get you started onto the program within 24 hours. In the meantime, please try not to drink, and we're going to talk about some ways that we can help you with that. Might that be a better thing to say? I think so. Now, that took me maybe 20 seconds longer to say than just don't take that first drink. But one has the capacity to save someone's life, and the other one has the capacity to almost certainly kill them. I don't mind the extra 20 seconds. Whenever those are the two potential outcomes, as greedy as I am with my time. So for those of you who are new around, I can only tell you what Alcoholics Anonymous would have me tell you. Our first tradition has us unify around a common purpose, a common solution, which is the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Our fifth tradition will have me stick to that. So what I need to say to you is, if you're hearing things like, wait until you meet a sponsor who you like, who has something that you want, I'd just be picking a sponsor with a hot wife and a fast car. What is that? The man who brought me through the steps the first time, my first sponsor, I didn't like him one bit. He was a former US Marine, and he kept telling me to do shit that I didn't want to do, like look at myself, and he was holding me accountable. I couldn't stand the guy. I adore him from the pit of my stomach now. But if I was to wait around for someone I liked, you know what that means to me? Someone who I can control and manipulate. So I don't know where that comes from. I don't know where this take your time, it's not a race, blah 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 blah. I don't know where that comes from. I know that what my book says is we sought the same escape with all the desperation of drowning men. Have you ever seen someone drown, Glenn? I've never seen that. But I imagine they're freaking out. I imagine they're looking for a very, very speedy remedy to the problem in which they find themselves. I imagine that's a bit of a dilemma. And if somebody was to hand over a stick into the water and say, grab hold of that, I'm going to wait until I meet somebody who I like. I'm just going to kick around here for a while, kicking and screaming, and hope I don't drown, if that's okay. What kind of crazy shit is that? And that's the stuff that we often hear in the rooms of AA, and I would like that to stop if that's okay. I have no control over what anybody else does, but I certainly have control over what I do and say, and I make no apology for saying that I find that kind of thing incredibly destructive. So my experience started off that way until I met a guy, the guy who I just mentioned a short while ago, and he talked about something that was just radical. You know, where I come from, we don't have meetings in which the big book's discussed until the one we started 5 years ago. But he was there, he shouldn't have been there, he's from out of town, he happened to be in this place. To say that it was serendipitous was somewhat of an understatement, because the world changed that night, not just for me, but for a number of people who came behind, where he talked about, well, he said things like, I'm not going to be okay. Everybody else was telling me I'm going to be okay. You'll be okay, just get to a meeting, keep coming back, it'll be fine. If you haven't took a drink today, you're already winning. I was thinking, I don't really feel like I'm winning. I feel like I'm going gradually more and more insane. I later learned that that is exactly what was happening, because I didn't have the only thing that I was using to treat my illness, i.e. alcohol. The alcohol had been taken away, so I was just untreated. The only thing to treat my illness was alcohol, and I wasn't able to have that. So whenever this chap was saying, you won't be okay, he went on to say that if I was like him, I have a progressive illness that gets worse, never better. Never better. Not from time to time, there's the odd one that gets better. Never better. The chronic alcoholic does not get better. It's not going to be okay. If there's anybody new around and you're in the rooms and you're wondering if you're going to be okay, no, you won't. You will not be okay. That's the truth. The truth is that untreated alcoholism takes your life. It may well take your sanity first, but one or the other is going to go, and potentially both. That's a sobering truth, isn't it? And that's what I was told, and that got my attention. Now, it was followed up with, having said that, we do have a solution. We have a whole chapter called There Is a Solution, and we have a whole chapter called How It Works. So there's no riddle. I guess, let me refer back to what it says in the book, actually, rather than spinning my own yarns, because they're somewhat less interesting. Dr. William D. Silkworth, who we account as no less than a saint, he was the top banana at Towns Hospital in New York, treated Bill Wilson. We all know him. He seemed to have served the purpose that continues to serve me to this day. But he talked about how people like me drink because they like the effect produced by alcohol. There you go. That's why I drank. Was it to do with childhood trauma? Was it to do with the paramilitary troubles that existed in my youth in Northern Ireland? Was it to do with guilt I'm carrying? Was it to do with that thing that happened? You know, sure, people have childhood trauma, of course they do, and some people carry some very difficult things. I'm not trivializing that. But the reason why I drank is because I liked the effect. I don't need to get Freudian to figure out what the hell's going on here. It goes on to say the sensation is so elusive that while admitted injurious, they cannot after a time differentiate the true from the false. Do you remember that? Remember that, Glenn, where you're like, you know, we don't even know. I don't know. To them, their alcoholic life seems the only normal one. Well, what do you mean quit drinking? That would be a ridiculous thing to do. How would I know whenever the working week's over if I don't neck a bottle of wine very, very quickly to draw a line between the working week and the weekend? What am I going to do? Who am I going to talk to? How am I going to find words? I'm certainly not going to be able to speak to women ever again for the rest of my life. What do you mean quit drinking? That seemed the only normal life. They are restless, irritable, and discontented unless they can again experience the sense of ease and comfort which comes at once by taking a few drinks. Doesn't say here that these guys get restless, irritable, and discontented and crave to cause so much trouble that they vomit all over themselves, wake up beside somebody else's wife and get into a fight and don't go to work for 3 days and lose their job. That was never my plan whenever I went out drinking. I never planned for any of those things to happen. Almost all of them did, incidentally. But that was never the plan. It says the ease and comfort which comes at once by taking a few drinks. So I have a few drinks, and how many is a few? Well, the book defines it as drinks which you see others taking with impunity. My brother goes out and sometimes with the intention of getting drunk. And he gets drunk and he wakes up the next day and has 2 aspirin, eats some fried food and goes for a swim and he's fine. I was still scurrying around trying to find some more booze. So his level of impunity was somewhat different to mine. Does it mean it's at that level? I don't know. Maybe it's you know, a couple of ladies I was talking to yesterday that were down the high street in the afternoon having a couple of Prosecco's and then planning to go off to work. Maybe that's impunity level, I don't know. But the point being, it wasn't the levels to which I drank. And what's the difference? Because if all I needed was the ease and comfort that comes for a few, why did I make the same decisions that the likes of Jim from the book made? Why did I keep on drinking? Why did I drink to the point where there's such a catastrophic meltdown? Because I have a physical allergy to alcohol. Whenever I take alcohol into my system in whatever form, something happens both bodily and mentally that makes it virtually impossible for me to stop most of the time. I'm very careful never to talk about this now because a couple of people approached me in our group quite recently saying, well, I didn't always have the reaction of the physical allergies. Sometimes it didn't and sometimes it did. Well, the book says it happens at certain times. It doesn't say it happens every single time. And it also says that it never happens in the average temperate drinker. Happened to me though. And that ease and comfort that I benefited from was snatched away from me whenever the chaos kicked in. The chaos that came as a result of the allergy. Now, let me be clear about this. I don't want this to be misunderstood. And if there's anybody new around, don't think what I'm about to say is an instruction. But if I was to have a couple of drinks every day, so if I had 2 pints of Guinness every day after work, would that be a bad thing? No. In the same way that having 2 Snickers every day is probably not a bad thing. But I've never gotten into trouble from having 2 drinks. I've never fallen out with my wife for having 2 drinks. I've never got into a fight. I've never lost my job. I've never said things that were stupid from having a small amount to drink. But I can't stop there. You know, now there's a mental obsession that brings me to the point where I take the small amounts even though I know it's going to get bad. So again, I don't wish to trivialize that part of it. But the problems that stack up and become astonishingly difficult to solve are as a result of what happens after I take the small amount that brought me to the place of ease and comfort. What do you do about a thing like that? What do you do about a crazy ass guy who has the sort of insanity where you deliberately pour poison into your system, knowing exactly what's going to happen, none of it good, and choosing to do it anyway? Here's where we get into the next problem. What was a problem for me is that there is no cure for this. There's no cure for being the sort of guy who deliberately pours an allergen on top of an allergy, if that is the allergy that the alcoholic suffers from, except a spiritual solution. Screw that. A spiritual solution? What do you mean, like going to church and praying and, I don't know, sitting around in a circle singing Kumbaya with a bunch of hippies or something? There's no way I was doing that shit. Spiritual solution, not in a million years, was my first thought. And I was resistant to that. I said to my sponsor, do you know what? I'm happy to go through the 12 steps with you, but why don't we maybe change a few of the words? Some of them are a wee bit out of date, like God. We maybe don't need that one. And anyway, he, as I said before, he was somewhat blunt, this chap. And we were sitting in his house, and he kind of leaned back, and he always had his book in his hand. He leaned back, and he was looking over his book, and he just says, do you know what that is? And he pointed over towards the door, and I was looking at what is? And I realized he meant the door. Well, yes, that's the door. He said, then why don't you use it and come back to me whenever you're ready? So that's how that negotiation went. Now, I'm not used to not being able to manipulate people, but I certainly wasn't successful with this chap. And of course, I went back the next day with my tail between my legs saying, all right, I just might be willing to accept that there's a slight possibility that there could be remotely a spiritual thing, maybe. He seemed content that that was enough. In fact, the book Alcoholics Anonymous is content that that's enough. I sometimes hear it say that on step 2, the realization of the power of God needs to be within me. I need to understand what God is. I need to be ready to buy into the whole God thing at step 2, but that is not what the book says. The book in step 2 is about my laying aside prejudice to the point where I become willing. I was saying the set aside prayer every day several times. You guys know the set aside prayer, right? And if you don't, send me a text, I'll send it to you. It's pretty good. And I was saying this all the time, working through this, seeing what really mattered, seeing that the willingness to be open-minded and around this was absolutely fundamental. Sorry, I forgot to switch that off. Seeing that the laying aside prejudice in terms of spiritual terms was going to be very useful for me. Maybe the God term's not my thing. Why don't I go for spirit of the universe? Whatever. All of these are capitalized. And what really worked for me was understanding how my prejudice worked, and understanding that what I believed to be the right thing may not necessarily always be the right thing. Tell you one thing, Glenn, that I did know, is that the way that I was living didn't work. So that's 100%. That's a fact. There was enough evidence to support that. And I'm sitting looking at a man who used to be a royal jackass just like me, and now he isn't. So that's evidence that that worked for him. So that's evidence that the 12-step program, as outlined in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, works. What I'm doing, there's evidence that that doesn't work, but it seemed more logical to do what I was doing. Like, what is that about? And the only way that I can explain that is that I was so entrenched with prejudice and so lost in prejudice, but it didn't need to evaporate immediately. I only needed a reasonable assumption as a starting point. Take, for example, electricity. There's a light switch over there. Whenever I flick the little switch thing, it's the same here in Ireland as it is in the United States, Glenn. The lights just come on, just by magic. Poof. You know, whenever I came in this morning, it was quite dark. I flicked the little switch, the lights came on. Did I look at it in awe, going, wow, the lights come on. It's amazing. I know nothing about electricity. I have not got a clue how that works. Now, I sponsored an electrical engineer once, and at this part on page 46 or whatever it is in the book, 48, he started to explain to me how electricity works. Now, that's 40 minutes of my life I will never get back again. I still haven't got a clue how electricity works. It's the most boring thing I've ever heard in my life. But the reasonable assumption I have as a starting point is that I've seen that work so many times that I don't need to doubt it. So many times. My office is in a tall building. We're on the ground floor. That building is held together with steel girders. Now, do I know the compound of a steel girder and how the engineers have been able to prove that it's robust enough to hold a building of that type? Absolutely not. Do I walk into the building every day looking up going, oh shit, today might be the day? Never. It has never occurred to me that that was going to be a problem, because I needed a reasonable assumption as a starting point. And that reasonable assumption was I've been in this building and many like it many, many, many times, and never once was it precarious. Never once. So what reasonable assumption can a new person take as a starting point? I had the example of my sponsor. The difficulty I had, though, and I'm going to great lengths to change this, is that he was in a desert of people and he was the only one talking about recovery. So I only had one example to tap into. Everybody else was fighting through it one day at a time with white knuckles, having a shitty time. I now surround myself with hundreds of people who do this. And whenever I sponsor somebody, they have access to hundreds of people who talk about this program and talk about how this works. So those people can see that as it's reasonable to assume that because this has worked with so many people so many times, it's possible that it might work for me. That is a reasonable assumption as a starting point. It worked for my friend Glenn. I'm so sorry. Switch it off. It worked for my friend Glenn. It worked for Carol. It worked for Roger Harvey. It's working for all these people who go to AA meetings not to talk about their bloody problems that nobody cares about, to talk about recovery, to talk about how it worked for them, so they can be beacons of hope and recovery. So the reasonable assumption that they needed can be presented to them in volume and numbers. Is that too much to ask? Because for somebody like me who didn't want to do your spiritual thing, I needed that. I needed what I would call normal people, non-churchgoers, you know, who have found a spiritual path for them, who are opening the doors to me for to say, you're welcome here and it's okay. And you may find God if you do this. What's the difference between may and may not? Just the realm of the spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding. Amazing, dead easy. No, it goes on to say, to those who earnestly seek. What does earnestly mean? With sincere and intense conviction. So these guys are giving me a reasonable assumption as a starting point. The instructions are that I need to knock my ass in and do the work. And then I get to meet a God of my understanding. See, what somebody told me before is I need to pick my own higher power, whatever that means, and then wrap the 12 steps around it. It can be your favorite sports team. It can be your celebrity. It can be a fucking garden gate or some nonsense. Nonsense. The one that cracks me up beyond belief is, don't say God, say God, good orderly direction. What does the book say? If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. So it's not good orderly direction. It says here it's not that. So at this stage in the book, how do I find this higher power? How do I get one to wrap the 12 steps around? Well, that's the tail wagging the dog, as it turns out. That's the wrong way to approach that. That's the cart before the horse. Stop me if I come out with any more of these. What does the book say? It says that lack of power is my dilemma. So let's get that straight. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. So it's not a group of drunks either. What a ridiculous thing. A bunch of people in AA rooms going to be a god, like, especially the rooms I went to, bloody hell. But where and how will we define this power? It says, well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main objective is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself, which will solve your problem. So I don't get a higher power around which I wrap the 12 steps. I work the 12 steps, and in the process of that, that is revealed to me. Where is it though? Do I go shopping around churches and synagogues and whatever, all of which is fine, might I add, but it talks here about a God that exists deep down within me. The hell does that mean? Do you know what? I didn't need to know. I didn't need to know, because it brings me to this point, Glenn, where it says, I had to fearlessly face a proposition that God is everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. What was our choice to be? That's on page 52 in the middle of the second step. Do you know what my choice was at that stage? Whenever the first time I went through the program, my choice is God is nothing, Mr. Sponsor. still not doing it. And that was fine, because it does not say here what the answer to that choice or that proposition has to be. It's continuing to allow me to have an open mind. It talks about me living by reason. It's trying to persuade me that it's more reasonable to believe than not believe. It's more reasonable to believe that Glenn's choices are better than the ones that I've been making up to now, still anchored on that reasonable assumption as a starting point. Is that not a fair way to look at this? It also goes on to talk about this really interesting thing on page 54. It says, with a better motive, had we not worshipfully beheld the sunset, the sea, or a flower. Then it says, who of us had not loved something or somebody? Bet you everybody here has loved something or somebody. How much did these feelings, these loves, these worships have to do with pure reason? My eldest daughter is going off to university. She's moving over to England. I live in Ireland. It's not that far away, but there's a sea between us. She moves on Friday, and I'm gutted. I'm delighted she's going, but I'm going to miss her tremendously because I adore her. Now, she costs a lot of money. She's messy. She's interested in stinking boys. You know, her friends come around to my house and make lots of noise. She is a right royal pain in the ass. So why is it that I adore her so much? I'll give you another one. I have 4 daughters, by the way, which explains my grey beard. My second youngest, a few years ago, came back from her little creche, and she drew me a little picture of an elephant. To Daddy, love Marnie, and a picture of an elephant. It was shit. It looked nothing like an elephant. It had pink spots. It was yellow. It had no resemblance to an elephant. I like pictures and stuff around the house. I know a wee bit about this stuff. That was poor art. To be fair, she was 4. But my experience with it was, oh my God, that's amazing. It hit me right in my solar plexus. It's like, oh man, I still have it. You know, like my heart was pouring out. What has that got to do with logic and reason? I ask you, Glenn, what has that got to do with anything like that? I can't explain that in the way that I can explain that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, yet there it is. And that and those kind of feelings are the substance of my life. Will I make enough money this month to pay the bills? I can work that out right down to the decimal points, and I can make the adjustments. Is that the substance of my life? No, it's not. The warmth I felt whenever Carol took her screen off to say hello there, to see my friend Roger here, you know, the warmth I have whenever I see someone who I sponsor get their kids back. Do you know what I mean? Like, can you explain these things? Because I can't. But on page 54, I believe, is getting me to wonder, might that be this thing that's deep down within me that existed the whole time? This abundance of love that is only ever clouded over with fear. Might that be it? It may be obscured by calamity, by pomp, by worship of other things, but in some form or another, it is there. But maybe the God deep down within is only for some people. We find the great reality capitalized deep down within us. In the last analysis, it is only there that he may be found. Interesting. So, it goes on to say, with this attitude you cannot feel. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. Isn't that an interesting term? The consciousness of your belief. It doesn't say my belief. It doesn't say my God. It doesn't say I'm going to be, this thing deep down within is going to be installed. It was there all along, Glenn. The consciousness of it is what had to change. I think of the spiritual experience appendix, where it says, with few exceptions, our members find that they have tapped an unexpected inner resource. Unexpected. It was there the whole time, which they presently identify with their own conception of a power greater than themselves. This is what I'm being invited to see. You know what? My prejudice were drifting away so quickly. I could buy into that. I could feel love in that. So whenever it came on to the third step where I'm having to make this big decision, have you ever heard this one? I love these lines in AA in the sense that I don't like them at all, these little quips. But you ever heard the one, don't make any big decisions in the first 2 years? Have you read step 3? Holy shit, that's the biggest decision ever. So whenever it came to step 3, I was ready. My prejudices were put in the place where they belonged, which was out of my ass. And I find myself looking at, well, I'm between page 60 and page 62. The word self is said 22 times. My sponsor had me circle every time it said self. And as we're getting halfway through, I was saying, I know, I get it. I get it. I can see where it's going. It's about me. But like in our home group, whenever we had physical meetings, a friend of mine who was struggling with alcoholism, he'd never been to a meeting before. I brought him to that meeting and we're talking about step 3 and we read all that stuff out and he heard that as being, I'm a decrepit character. I'm a bad person. You know, I've caused harm to my family. It's all me. I'm a fault. It's me, and the self. And I don't believe that that's what it is at all. The egoic mind within me thinks of nothing other than furthering my own gains. And the degree to which I surrender to that is the degree to which all these problems happen. But before I've worked up to halfway through step 9, I have no control over that. And I don't mean that as an excuse for my behaviors, because there's accountability that comes with that. But I was never a bad guy. I was never a particularly good guy. But I was never this bad, decrepit fella who came to AA and became good. Selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. The root of our troubles. I've recently got into keeping these little house plants at home. I'm late to the party of this whole thing, right? And I really struggled. You know, that's really hard work to maintain them damn things. And at the start, they kept getting rotten. So I just give them more water. Poor things are probably thirsty. You kept getting lots and lots and lots of water, right? And then the leaves kept dying. It's like, what am I doing wrong? And then, you know, I did what I should have done at the start and asked somebody who knew about such things. And they were saying that I put so much water in that the roots were rotten underneath. They're rotten in all the water. Now, I couldn't see that. It was below the surface, inside a pot, 2 pots in actual fact. But the manifestation of that was in the leaves, but I couldn't see what was happening in the roots. I was trying to treat the leaves where the problem was in the root. I'm trying to treat my drinking. I'm trying to treat my behavior. I'm trying to do the next right thing. I'm trying to do all this other stuff that wasn't within my gift because the problem was in the root. And what does that look like? Driven by 100 forms of fear, 100 forms of self-delusion, 100 forms of self-seeking, and 100 forms of self-pity. That is horrendous. Now, my dearest love, Susie, who's also a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, she's not here, so I can say this. You did say this was recorded, Glenn, so this might bite me in the ass, but she is a wild driver. Wild. And whenever I get into the car with her, I have no control over what's about to happen. Let's just say she drives with vigor. So I can try to influence the outcome of that journey as much as I like, but if she says we're going right, even if I want to go left. But what if the driver is fear? What if the driver is self-delusion, self-seeking, self-pity, or 100 forms of each of those at the same time? What are the chances of there being a positive outcome? None, I tell you. That's my experience. How do we fix that? Well, here's the how and why of it. I love that. Here's the how and why of it. It's a bit like, this is really simple, so listen up. First of all, we had to quit playing God. Why? It didn't work. How? Quit playing God. Why? It didn't work. As we would say in Belfast, knock it off because you're shit at it. Simple as that. Stop doing that, doesn't work. And instead, adopt this new way of doing things. Accept that you're not the director of this play. You're the actor. Now, I know some actors. Those guys have really important jobs. They're active jobs. They rehearse their lines. They turn up on time. You know, it's not, I don't see anything here that talks about this submissive thing. You know, I hear these people saying about just hand it over to God, just hand it over. I don't see anything to support that. It talks about these other active roles. So I'm not the director and the actor. I'm not the principal, but I am the agent. I'm an agent of God. a spearhead of God's ever advancing creation. How'd you like that for a lofty title? See the looks I get in Belfast whenever I say that. It's crazy. But I'm not the father, I'm the child. I'm a child of God. I have a birthright to abundance by virtue of the fact that I'm royalty. Now there's bold language, because I'm sick to the back teeth of hearing this kind of stuff being talked in the context of, oh, well, you're a child of God, give it over, you're submissive, and if you're a good boy, God's going to look after you. I don't see it like that. I don't think it reads like that, because when we sincerely took such a position, all sorts of remarkable things happened. Well, imagine if I said, when we sincerely took such a position, all sorts of okay things would happen sometimes if you behave yourself. That'd be a shit deal. It says here, remarkable. We had a new employer being all powerful. He provided what we needed. And then there's the condition, if we kept close to him and performed his work well. Fair enough. And then it leads us on to the third step prayer, which I read as a partnership agreement to build with me and to do with me. I have the bondage of self taken away from me. That's what I get out of the deal. What I give back, that I can better do God's will. Take away my difficulties. What, the drinking difficulty? Sure, but all of them. Take the lot. But what I give back, that I can bear witness. And what am I bear witnessing to, Glenn? That I've managed to make it to bed tonight, having prayed for a sober day this morning. I have no experience of that. I have experience of the planets aligning in such a way that there's so much serendipity in my life, I can no longer call it serendipitous. And I can ring fence that with the word remarkable. Remarkable things have happened to me since I've done this program and was placed into the hands of a God that I refuse to believe in. That all happened the second I said the third step prayer. Not true. This is when the games really began. On that fourth step, I'm running out of time very quickly because I tend to fly off in tangents, so I'm going to rattle through this quite quickly. The fourth step has me look at me. And not just the part of me that I want you to see or that I want to see, the stuff deep down within that maybe presents things from an entirely different angle, not the angle I want to look at it, because the angle that has you to blame for all of this is perfectly fine for me. At least so I thought. But whenever I can put the wrongs of other people out of my mind entirely and see where I'm at with this, having first recognized that maybe they're just sick people too. Maybe everybody in this planet is just doing the best they can with what they've got, and maybe what some people have is not that much. Not from a place of judgment, of course, but just like, wow, okay. It turns out we're just a bunch of squirrels trying to get enough nuts to get through the winter, without exception. And I'm judging that guy for the way he's doing it, while at the same time I'm causing so much chaos myself. And what about the people that actually have done me real harm? So what? Am I still sitting with that? Am I still making that about other people? Can I get the opportunity to own that? And to see that right here, right now, in this present moment, I'm a different person who has different abilities? Or do I enjoy dining out on the self-pity that comes with the things that happened to me in the past? Really harsh thing to say to somebody who suffered some bad stuff maybe in childhood. Nobody said this is going to be easy. If somebody suffered something horrendous whenever they were a child at the hands of an adult, it's my viewpoint that is always the fault of the adult. Always, without exception. But we're all grown up now. And it was my experience that I needed to take ownership of everything that happened in my life. I needed to have a look at my fears. I needed to have a look at my sex conduct. Both of which had some challenging areas that needed to be embraced, particularly in terms of how I viewed my behavior with members of the opposite sex, as is my preference. It was all wrong. It was all wrong. It wasn't serving me or the other parties. Nobody was being served because it was all riddled with fear. It was all wrapped around fear, and it was all wrapped around dependency. It was all wrapped around these things that were of no real benefit to me. But once all this data was written down, I got to talk about it in front of somebody else. The book says about doing your fifth step with person or persons in the plural. In our sponsorship lineage, we do our fifth step with at least 5 people. I did the steps again last year and did the fifth step with 20 people. I'm so free of that shit, it's unbelievable. If anybody wants to know about the stuff in my past, fine. Or if anybody says, oh, I've heard some stuff about you in the past, amazing. Let's talk about it, because I've talked to everybody else about it. I'm so free. I'm so free of it. But in step 6, this is where I think it really gets real. I thought it was getting real up to that point. But in step 6, are you now ready to let God remove from us all the things which we admitted are objectionable? Can he take them all, every one? If we still cling to something we will not let go, we ask God to help us be willing. What was I clinging on to? I want everybody to like me. I want to believe that all the money I need will come from this one particular source. You know, I want that woman to love me more. Or I want that woman to leave, whatever. I'm clinging on to these things. I'm suffering from this delusion that I can wrest happiness and satisfaction out of this world if I only manage better or well, whatever it is. I'm clinging on so tight to being in control. And step 7 provided the answer to that for me. It really did, because there's this question of, do the character defects get taken away, or do we work on them for times to come? Apparently there's some rock that needs dropped or something, I don't know. But what it actually says here is that I give God all of me, the good and the bad. I thought it was just the bad. That's not what it says. I gave God all of me, and then to take away whatever I don't need in whatever given moment on the basis of me being of service to other people. It turns out that I don't have any character defects. Isn't that amazing? Not one. Step 7 for me was the realization that character defects don't exist. Having said that, if the egoic me was to grab hold of any of my characteristics and run with them, disaster will follow. I would smother my children with kindness and love to the point where they're not capable of functioning on their own. So does that mean that kindness and love is a character defect? Well, of course not. That's ridiculous. What about anger? Is that a defect? Because I would have thought so. I find it perfectly appropriate to use anger in the right times in the right ways. This dualistic thinking in around the characteristics of what makes me human was causing me problems. There are no defects. This goes back to step 3, in my viewpoint, and I mean no disrespect to those who read it differently. I go back to step 3, that this is about having a new employer. It's about handing the strings of the puppet that is me to someone that knows how to use the damn thing, so that those characteristics can be used in a really positive, useful way to the betterment of other people. Isn't that wonderful? As I go out to do God's bidding, that starts with step 8. I make a list of all the people that harmed. I did it in step 4, transferred across. I go out and make direct amends to people. Guess what happened? The unexpected. How often? 9 times out of 10. Some weird was in this book. Almost everything happened to me at exactly the right time. And before I got halfway through, weird shit happened. I was certain that I could not drink even if I would. Now that's as weird as it gets, because I would have drank it out of Glenn's shoes. And his feet are disgusting. So that's in itself was beyond belief. But what about being able to intuitively handle situations that used to baffle me? Like, that's a superpower, isn't it? You know, that's a remarkable thing that happened to me. In the 10th step, and I carry these little 3x5 cards around with me where I take a note of selfishness, dishonesty, resentment, and fear. At the end of the night, I take that data to the 11th step evening review. I answer all those questions. The one in particular is, you know, what could I have done better? It doesn't say, is there something I could have done better? I get all of this down in the most kind and loving way. There's no room for remorse. It's not about that. You know, I'm asking God's forgiveness. And what does that mean? Well, it means forgiveness in the sense that, well, if you look at the word sin, it's an archery term meaning to have missed the mark. So where have I missed the mark today? This is good. It's amazing. You know, give me some corrective measures so I can learn from that. So tomorrow I mightn't miss the mark in the same way. Amazing. What about the growth from that? What about waking up the next day and asking for to be divorced from self-pity, dishonest, and self-seeking motives? What about looking at what happens when they're removed? Whenever you remove those, what fills that vacuum? The power of God passing through me replaces self-pity. Dishonesty, remove that. Stop lying to myself about how shit life is and maybe feel the abundance. Self-seeking motives, what replaces that? Altruism, being of service to other people. Every day I get myself poised, wind up. I remember I used to have one of those. Do you remember Evil Knievel, the motorcycle guy? I used to have an Evil Knievel toy where you wind it up in the morning and the start, and then you press the button and it flies off. I leave the house like that, launching off, wind up and ready to go. Spearhead of God's ever advancing creation. Get down to the end of the street and some car pulls out in front of me and like, shit, I better get back to my 10th step and keep myself aligned with this stuff. Keep myself aligned with the will. And I sponsor people to the point where it's a right royal pain in the ass. It's bloody inconvenience. Sherry's nodding. You know what I mean, don't you? And, you know, my partner's in AA. She lives in Edinburgh. She came to visit me a few weeks ago. She arrived at the airport. I got a phone call from one of my sponsees. One of her sponsees was taken really bad. We spent the whole day in Queen Victoria Hospital in Belfast. And, you know, oh man, the romance I'd planned was straight out the window, and not one of us questioned that once. It's what we do. It's what we do. Why? And I'll finish with this, Glenn, because I'm running out of time, right? Why? Why do I do all this? Why does this matter to me? Why did I push it to the point of inconvenience? Because both you and the new man, page 100 says, must walk day by day in the path of spiritual progress. If you persist, this word again, remarkable things will happen. Remarkable things will happen. When we look back, we realize that the things which came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands were better than anything we could have planned. Glenn, whenever I look back now, I can write a list of the things I kept in my hands and a list of the things I put in God's hands, and guess the difference. One list ended remarkably and the other one ended at best disappointingly and usually disastrously, without exception. It's a joy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.